Alrighty, we will get underway here. First, we're going to read through chapter 2. So you might want to open your Bibles to Ruth chapter 2. We'll just read through the chapter, and then we'll go back and discuss. Okay? Keep in mind that the titles that are placed in the various translations and editions are not in the original text. There are no division titles, there are no paragraphs, there weren't even verses and chapters originally. Those are later editions for ease of reading. So for Bible study, it's best to just ignore whatever those titles are in your text, because that's some editor's decision about what's coming next. And sometimes those titles are accurate, and sometimes they're not so helpful. So in the NRSV, this one's fairly nondescript. Ruth meets Boaz. Yeah, that actually is what happens, and there's not much interpretation there. Now, Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, a prominent rich man of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain behind someone in whose sight I may find favor." She said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she went. She came and gleaned in the field behind the reapers. As it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Just then Boaz came from Bethlehem. He said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." They answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, "To whom does this young woman belong?" The servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the Moabite who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers." So she came, and she has been on her feet from early this morning until now, without resting even for a moment. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Keep your eyes on the field that is being reaped and follow behind them. I have ordered the young men not to bother you. If you get thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn." Then she fell prostrate with her face to the ground and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your sight, that you should take notice of me when I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told me, and how you left your father and mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." Then she said, "May I continue to find favor in your sight, my lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, even though I am not one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some of this bread and dip your morsel in the sour wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he heaped up for her some parched grain. She ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she got up to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, "Let her glean even among the standing sheaves, and do not reproach her. You must also pull out some handfuls for her from the bundles, and leave them for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. She picked it up and came into town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gleaned. Then she took out and gave her what was left over after she herself had been satisfied. Her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today, and where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and said, "The name of the man with whom I worked today is Boaz." Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, Blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a relative of ours, one of our nearest kin." Then Ruth the Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay close by my servants until they have finished all my harvest.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is better, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, otherwise you might be bothered in another field." So she stayed close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Okay, chapter 2. Well, what strikes you, or what do you notice? Let's start with that.
I thought it was interesting that Naomi asked her, like, who did you glean with or for? Like she suspicioned there was some favor given them. I mean,
It was a huge amount of grain that Ruth collected. 30 pounds approximately is an ephah. So it's really not an amount that one person really could have collected in one day, just physically. So, yeah, there had to be something going on.
My Bible said half a bushel. I mean, in a note at the bottom.
Yeah, that's probably about right. Yeah, in terms of, that's a measure of volume. A bushel basket is about like that and about that deep. So that's a lot. That's collecting it. That's beating it off the stalk. That's getting the hulls removed from it. To do that in a day by hand with, minimal tools would just be physically impossible for a person. So it's clear from the amount that someone has simply given her a bunch of grain.
I also thought it was interesting that not only did Boaz say it's okay for you to be there, he also provided protection for her from others, from his own workers, from others who may harass her, bother her. He gave her protection.
An unaccompanied woman would simply be fair game for any and every male, and particularly someone who's not an Israelite. How many times in one chapter do we have to be reminded that she's from Moab? Ruth the Moabite, who is from Moab. Okay, we got it.
She came from Moab.
And she came from Moab. We got it, really. But, this is clearly a big deal for the writer. This is a woman who's a foreigner. She would not have had protection.
He even warns her. Don't go to another field. Stay in my field.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Because it would not, she could not be safe. She could, in fact, she could expect to be molested. So Boaz assumes almost immediately this role of protector. He's going to get a promotion in just a few verses later here to the role of redeemer, which is a technical term in Hebrew, goel, which really means one who restores the fortunes of the family. Okay, so protector is one thing, and redeemer is a step up from that. So that's where we're headed. But this is the beginning. Whether husband is a promotion or a demotion, you can decide at that point. Yeah. But that's another step in the process as well.
Well, and obviously either Naomi had gone to him or somebody close to Naomi had gone to him because he knew all about her. I mean, he couldn't Google her, so...
Right. So Boaz has all this insider information about Ruth, that it appears that she's not shared with him. And there are things that happened in the field between the time that he asks, to whom does this young woman belong, and the time that he talks with her, because he says, I've already told my young men not to bother you, told them to do this, that, and the other thing. So, I mean, the narrative is a little compressed at that moment. There are things that happen behind the scenes there. Remember again, Bethlehem, and that's where we're at now. We're in the area of Bethlehem. This would have been a small village. Everyone knew within minutes, I'm sure, that there was a stranger in town. And it, oh my goodness, a Moabite woman from Moab, who is a Moabite from, right. This is a big deal. So, rumor and gossip in village culture are means both of social communication, certainly, but also social regulation. This is how you keep people on the straight and narrow, is that there's always the risk that everyone will know your business. And if you don't want someone to know that you've done something, don't do it. Because otherwise, they will.
They will find out.
So we see some of that village culture at work here. And that continues in the New Testament. Lots of Jesus' ministry happens in village culture, not urban culture. It's in small villages, and there are crowds which, we're thinking 5, 10, 15,000 people. I mean, in village culture, a couple of hundred would be a really big crowd if there are only 50 people who live in the village. And people are talking about Jesus. Word spreads. Gossip and rumor are the way, they are the internet of the first century. Yeah, so that's right. Boaz couldn't Google her to get some background information, but didn't need to, because the social network of the time was much more efficient.
If you've ever lived in a small town, you know exactly.
Right.
Does it say in here whether she was a beautiful woman?
Yeah.
Her physical description in the actual text is never mentioned, but the rabbis who interpret this, very early on, are just pretty sure that she must really be a stunner. She must really be beautiful, and that's for two reasons. On the one hand, these endangered women in the Old Testament generally fit the template. There's a pattern that they are beautiful. That starts with Sarah. Is Jesus calling you, or? I'm teasing. It starts with Sarah. Her first name is Sarai. It means princess. She's never described physically necessarily as beautiful, but at least two powerful men want to have Sarah for their as part of their harems, because Abraham has to tell her twice, "Tell them you're my sister, so they don't kill me." He gives her up to save his own neck. So there's this pattern of these beautiful women who are part of David's genealogy. And the other part that the rabbis speculate is, she's this Moabite woman from Moab who's a Moabite. So for Boaz to be that interested, she must have been really beautiful, because otherwise, why bother with this foreigner?
Did he have a harem?
No, probably not. It's not described if he was married or not, if he had existing wives. I mean, it's not mentioned in the account. It might have been possible, but I think not likely in the context of the story. The impression we get, again, it's just an impression, it's not in the text, I don't think, but the impression is that this is sort of an older bachelor. Again, we don't know, but there's that kind of impression. Sometimes it's hard to tell if we're reading back from one text into another. We can read forward from Ruth to Mary, for example. Mary in the Magnificat will talk about how have I found favor. Joseph traditionally is older than Mary and is kind of her rescuer, protector, redeemer. There's some conversation or similarities or parallels between those situations. Are we sort of reading back from Mary and Joseph into Boaz, Ruth and Boaz? Maybe. So no, we don't know for sure what his situation was, but in the narrative, I think we assume a well-to-do, little bit older bachelor who is a cousin to, we think, to Naomi.
Naomi's husband.
Yeah, it would be to Elimelech. Yeah, it does say that, Elimelech's house. But it's interesting how, now remember, this is a patrilocal culture, and that means that the wife becomes a part of the husband's family. So, biologically, genetically, Connie, you're quite right. This is through Elimelech. But if you look in verse 20, for example, it's very interesting. There are several things in chapter 2, verse 20 that are interesting, but one of the interesting things is Naomi also said to her, to Ruth, the man is a relative of ours. Did that strike you? I mean, this Moabite from Moab who's a Moabite, he's a relative of ours. One of our nearest kin. Well, that's kind of striking. Ruth is not an Israelite.
Yeah, but I would say, if it were me talking to my daughter-in-law about my husband's brothers, nephews, whatever, I'd say he's a relative of ours.
We don't live in a specifically patrilocal culture. Different family systems operate in different ways, I think, and some of that is somewhat cultural. In your experience, when as you have married, for our online audience here today, it's all women. I am the thorn among the roses. And in your experience, have you more joined your husband's family or the other way around? Because in our culture, it's not just one way or the other. Families vary a bit.
But if it was patriarch and she, then why did Naomi urge them to go back to their parents?
She did, didn't she?
She did urge them to go back to their parents because that patrilocal connection was broken when the husbands died.
Maybe if Naomi's husband was still alive, maybe she wouldn't have urged him to go back to their families but as it is, Naomi can't take care of it.
Yeah, I think that's a legitimate speculation. Again, we don't know, but if Elimelech had remained alive and it was only the sons who had died, there would still have been a male who
Protector,
possesses No, it's about possession. To whom does this young woman belong? Boaz asks. You know, this is to have an identity in such a culture as a woman. Really, you must be someone's wife or daughter or at least younger sister.
She can't belong to Naomi?
No.
Not really.
No, not really. Now, that's what happens. Ruth pledges herself to Naomi. You know, your people will be my people, your God will be my God, your land will be my land. I mean, she adopts not only Naomi, but Naomi's clan and tribe and religion, you know, which all goes together, remember. These are not separable things. If you if you become part of somebody's family, you take on their gods as well. So Ruth has done this sort of adopting, this pledge of loyalty. But neither one of them really has a man to whom they belong. Ruth, for example, didn't have a protector. She was vulnerable. She was exposed. And there would have been no one to take revenge.
Who was going to be taking care of Naomi?
There wasn't anyone.
Ruth is
Yeah,
gonna
Ruth takes on that role. Yeah, Ruth goes out at considerable risk to herself. Ruth goes out to glean. Ruth is not protected. Neither is Naomi, although Naomi goes back to be a widow in her clan, so she has some position again now. You know, the women of Bethlehem welcome back Naomi, remember. There was no mention of Ruth in that welcome. Yeah, hooray, Naomi's back. There wasn't even, who's this other woman with you? She's not even mentioned. So Naomi has some place, but no one to provide for her except Ruth.
But I think Boaz actually recognized that because he knows that Ruth protects Naomi by providing her food and stuff, because he keeps saying, make sure she has enough food, you know, make sure she does this. I mean, he's really looked into this whole family dynamics.
Well, he is clearly, I mean, Boaz appears to be the sort of the senior male in this extended family. That's what it looks like, and that's what it will look like down the line. On the one hand, when it comes to the negotiation for the family property in chapter 4, there is a relative, a male relative who has a prior claim on the land, but Boaz is able to negotiate for that, and it's not much of a negotiation. I mean, it's really Boaz saying, you know, you don't have any money and I do. Why don't you let me do this? You know, which...
Well, if I remember, when Boaz asks who has a claim on her, and then if nobody else does, I will take her, and then he's talking about what? He's not talking about the land, he's talking about her person.
I think all of the above, Ruth. I mean, on the one hand, I
jumped ahead there.
Yeah,
I know.
No, this is, I mean, the relationship between Boaz and Ruth, I mean, you know, with Naomi in there, how does it work culturally and legally? I mean, even if this is a folk tale or a tract for the times, I mean, it still has to make sense to people how things work. I think there are some things that are sort of a little fanciful in here maybe, but really it reflects how the relationships actually worked. So the negotiation that happens between Boaz and this other male relative is first about the land, and Ruth happens to come along with it, and Naomi. And so that's part of the argument that Boaz will make in the negotiation. Maybe you get the ground, but you assume, he says to the other male, you assume these responsibilities as well. And are you ready to do that? So,
so now she belongs to land instead of
land is everything.
Man?
I mean, land is the source of wealth, stability, and identity, and it's given by God. Remember, this is the promised land. And so, yeah, land is tremendously important, and it belongs to Elimelech, not
But
Naomi.
She was a Moab, so that land would have been in Moab and not in...
No, we're talking about land in the Bethlehem area that would have belonged to Elimelech.
To what?
To Elimelech, Naomi's husband, who's died, and it's still there. It's kind of in the general fund of this clan. And in order for Elimelech's line to continue, that has to be restored to his immediate family. But there's no male to take it on. Now, whether this actually is how it happened all the time in specific kinds of historical relationships, we don't know. But that's how it's described here in the story. Okay?
Back to where you said that Naomi said the man is a relative of ours and one of our nearest kin. You explain why you think it was Ruth, not Naomi's husband, when she said our. If I was talking to somebody, John's in mind, I would say our, but you thought she was including Ruth in that.
You may be right, but she's speaking directly to Ruth.
Well,
but you may well be right that the intention is that Naomi is talking about he is ours, as in Elimelech, and possibly. But I don't think so, because in other places in the text, when Naomi talks about her, inheritance or role specifically, then she says my. And this ours is next to relative like that, I think is significant. Now, that can't be. I mean, this is how biblical scholars have job security, Yeah. Because no, I don't think that I could definitively demonstrate that. I don't think so. So you may be right, or it may be on the part of the writer intentionally ambiguous as well. There are things in this text that leave a lot of room for the imagination and speculation, which is one reason why it generates so much interest. It is, I love Jonah and the artistry of Jonah and the comedy of Jonah. But Ruth is a much more finely crafted story. It's the most artful, I think, narrative in our Old Testament. There are pieces in other books that are artful and powerful, but as an entire document, this is pretty stunning. Esther is great fun, for example, and it'll be a good story, but it's not nearly as subtle as Ruth is. Which is why I'm not sure we'll even be done with Ruth by Christmas. Because
Hey, we only have about one more chapter to do.
Well,
two.
you're right. We have 2 more after this. We have a lot of rabbit trails to follow after that, though. I mean, that I haven't really mentioned yet. Yes, Connie.
Okay, in verse 2.
Mm-hmm.
We did 2 and we only got 4 to do. We only have 4 chapters.
So Ruth 2, verse 2.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Ruth the Moabite says to Naomi, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain behind someone whose sight I might find favor. Are we looking for a husband, or are we looking for a protector, or are we looking for a lot of grain?
Well, what do you think?
I think she's looking for a man.
You have a suspicious nature, you know.
If you want to find favor,
Yeah.
it's that word favor.
Let's see here. And said to her, go, my daughter, in whose sight I might find favor, and said to her, and she said to her, okay, let me back up here, in whose sight,
I might find favor.
okay, Amatz. Keep talking while I look this up.
Well, I'm thinking she's looking for more than grain.
Not for herself.
You have,
Yeah, well,
you have an evil mind.
no, I
She
just,
set this whole thing up.
she's desperate.
Chapter 3 says how much she set them up.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
So Ruth is always already looking to find favor. And I don't blame her because she,
Don't belong to nobody.
Well,
Yeah.
because Naomi had groomed her,
yeah.
you know, instead of
Mhm,
like, you are
exactly.
beautiful, you know, he is part of our lineage going back to the, you know, to
And
Naomi's
he's
husband.
powerful,
Yeah,
and he would be a good,
and he has, you know, the privilege to take care of us because he is a kinsman.
Connie, be careful.
But in the narrative, you know, there's something odd here, though, too. I mean, you know, Ruth doesn't know about Boaz at this point, and Naomi has still failed to mention this.
Well, don't you think she's hinting?
Which she? Ruth or Naomi?
yeah.
Yeah, I think
Well-
she's kind of hinting, except, like, she's not really, like,
He's a prominent rich man.
but she's
She's
left
tell
out
her
some,
where to go and.
No,
didn't
Naomi
tell
doesn't
her.
tell her where to go.
Yeah, she just didn't tell her.
Just
No,
go out
she
to a
doesn't
field.
Tell her about the relative until after Ruth comes back.
So Ruth is looking for a man, any man? Not necessarily Boaz? You know that, I'm seriously.
Yeah.
no,
I think
she's
looking
kind of,
for food.
yeah,
Yeah.
Yes, and, yeah, I agree.
And protection.
and I think Naomi, you know, when you talk about the fact that Boaz knew all this stuff about Naomi and Ruth and their
Yeah.
relationship, I think Naomi knew that he would kind of like take her in the field, or she was counting on that. And she's pretty manipulative. I'm pretty impressed.
I'd like to
There it is.
manipulate my daughter into somebody else.
It is on.
Geez, that's on.
It is unfortunate that those of you who are watching online can't quite hear all of the side comments. Ruth's virtue and motivation are being called into serious question at this point. Well, no, I don't know about that. So the word for favor is just a little, and Connie, you may well be right. I mean, this is part, I think, of the complex artistry of this story. We can't quite figure her out. And is Ruth only operating from one motive? Does any of us? Yeah, I mean, we don't. You know, I mean, are there lots of things going on? So in this Hebrew lexicon, the word for favor is chen, and it can mean agreeableness or charm, so attractive or pleasing. It can mean favor and specifically it can be the approval or the affection of someone, a wife with her husband. That's in Deuteronomy. It can mean to find pleasure or satisfaction. So it's a word that can mean several things. Favors a fine non-committal translation. It doesn't commit the translators to one part of the meaning or another, so that's fine. But all the things we've talked about are in that word. And literally it is that I might find approval or satisfaction or pleasure or whatever that is in his, and the word that follows it has a male ending to it, in his eyes, whoever that he is. So that's I don't know if that's conclusive, but that's the Hebrew.
So did both Boaz and Naomi think of her as a possession, because both of them call her daughter, which to me is a possessive description.
Not only daughter, but my daughter.
Right.
Yeah, it certainly has that element to it. You know, what status or standing does Ruth have apart from that?
Mm-hmm.
None.
Well, on the first verse, it says that that Naomi had a relative on her husband's side.
Right.
And so therefore she is pushing her into a certain area.
Well, maybe.
I mean, I'm not saying she's pushing her into a romantic thing. I meant from the standpoint that for protection.
Right. We should be clear that romance, you know, this invention of the Middle Ages, French poets in the Middle Ages, is really probably not a concern in the Book of Ruth. It doesn't hurt. There's nothing wrong with it, but it is really not the priority, you know, that somehow Ruth is supposed to find her soulmate. This is not, this is to find someone who's going to protect, provide, and preserve.
But she does have children later on it too.
She does, yeah. Now, we know as the readers, I mean, here's the narrator, I think, messing with us a little bit. We know as readers in verse 1 that there's this relative. Yeah, we get that from the narrator. Doesn't say that Ruth knows that. We know it, and so when it happens, you know, we've been let in on the secret, but it doesn't say that Naomi tells Ruth that. Now, there are other things going on in the background we don't hear too, so it's not conclusive, but it doesn't say, oh, and by the way, Naomi mentioned to Ruth that she might run across this guy. That doesn't happen, or that's not said.
Well, yeah, but yeah. Yeah, you just.
But on
Yeah.
your paper, you kind of talk about this possession. You know, when you go, to whom does this woman belong? A woman had to belong
Yep.
to a man, father, older brother, or son. Or in this case, since the father and the sons were both gone, it was the next, it's my understanding, it was like the next cousin, the next brother, the next.
Yep, the next closest male relative. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But Ruth doesn't have, or technically doesn't have
No.
a closest male relative in Israel. Remember, she's a Moabite from Moab. Who's a Moabite? I mean, there's a reason why we get smacked with that repeatedly.
And I don't see Ruth as, I guess, feeling that confident. You know, she already has said, whatever her motivation was, which my idea of her motivation is, I can't go back to Moab. There's nothing in Moab for me. The only place I might have some safety is with Naomi. And so when they go into this is Naomi's town. This is not her town. She's a foreigner. We don't know if she looks different physically from others. We don't know that really.
Doesn't matter in a village of a couple hundred people.
To her, I think it is. She knows she's taken a risk to go out into the fields. She's alone. She's a foreigner. She doesn't belong to anybody. And so when it says, that I want to go into the field, or let me go to the field and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor, anyone who will let me be there, because I'm not even a part of this community. And so I see that more as find favor, find protection, find safety, find food, because she does, maybe she is beautiful, but I think she's the last one to know it right now. She's the last one to know that there's any kind of chance for her in this place.
She is vulnerable, exposed.
It's a case of necessity.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
think so too.
Absolutely.
I think so too, and I think there again, that is love also, because she knows that Naomi is, we assume that Naomi is not at the age that she can stand the heat and the physical labor, and Ruth is younger and could get them food. I see it more out of necessity, and yes, I know I'm taking a risk. I don't know if I'm going to be safe or not, but I got to try because we got to eat.
And on the one hand, we could read this all as, Ruth as vulnerable victim, and Naomi as outcast and all of that. We can also read it as here are a couple of women who really have kind of taken the situation in hand, and are figuring it out in a system that is stacked against them. So it's always important to make sure that we don't read the agency right out of Ruth or Naomi, because the text doesn't support that either. They may be in a very tenuous situation, but they're figuring it out with no help, really.
I really feel like men shouldn't read this book, only women, because this is how it works.
So
You're oblivious to what's going on here.
But I'm very impressed with, to me, this chapter is about Boaz and his character and his compassion. Because immediately he meets his reapers and he blesses them. Lord bless you.
Yeah.
Right away you see the character, the concern he has and the compassion he has and the relationship that he has with his own people, with his workers, which I think would be kind of rare.
So Boaz is described as an honorable man, huh?
Yeah, and then when he blesses Ruth and says, may the Lord, reward you, and he's saying, he's blessing her with the God of Israel. He's saying, yes, our God is your God, which,
Remarkable.
yeah.
Quite remarkable that Boaz would immediately cover her with the blessing of the God of Israel. Now, I use that language of cover advisedly because that's exactly the language that's going to be used later, that Naomi wants to make sure that Boaz covers Ruth with his cloak of protection. One of the lenses to bring to the Book of Ruth is to ask and try to answer the question, who's the hero? Is it Ruth? Is it Boaz? Is it the God of Israel? There's no right answer printed down somewhere that you can check against that. I mean, that simply is a lens through which to look at the story. But who's the hero? Does it shift from place to place in the story as it appears to? The role of the God of Israel is very mysterious and quite behind the scenes in a lot of ways here. It's interesting, for example, in verse 3, Ruth and Naomi have this plan for gleaning, and so Ruth goes, she comes, she gleans in the field, and then there's this little phrase, as it happened. In the Jewish Publication Society translation, which would be, that's the translation you'd find in the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, it's translated as by chance. You know, there's this sense that things are happening by chance or accidentally, but not really. It may appear that way on the surface, but not really.
But you made a comment about the things moving into Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, because later on, and I'm jumping ahead, but later on when she becomes, you know, the whatever grandmother of David, that was supposed to be.
Yeah. I think that the writer may well be making that case that this is all part of the plan. This foreigner who's brought in, that's how it's supposed to be. Certainly when we read the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew or in Luke, either one, you know, Ruth shows up in those lists. There are 4 women who show up in the genealogy of Jesus in the Gospels, and Ruth is one of them. Well, that's remarkable. This Moabite from Moab who's a Moabite, I mean, it shows up in the genealogy of Jesus. Well, okay, as it should be, as it's supposed to be. You know, then we have to ask ourselves again a lens question. You know, are we reading this as if it was written, for example, during or shortly after the time of David, and it's dealing in David's time or Solomon's time with this foreigner who's part of Jesus or of David's genealogy? Is it really written and read in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah when foreign marriages are being required to be terminated after the exile, and someone's writing reminding them of this story when a foreigner is part of David's line? So why in the world do we have to end these marriages? You know, which lens do we read the story at that point? Is it God's intention that Israel's genealogy should include foreigners right along? Ezra and Nehemiah said, no, no, that's not how it should be. So how, you know, what's standing behind this story? What we think can shape how we read some of these things as well. But there is, you're right, Ruth, there is this clear sense that the hand of the God of Israel is shaping and guiding this in a particular direction that's not obvious to the people in the story, as it happened, or by chance. Those kinds of phrases show up a couple of times. We as the readers, we know better. I mean, the narrator kind of winks at us every so often. You know, well, we know that it's not really by chance, because after all, there's this relative that Naomi has that we know about, but Ruth doesn't. You know, so there's some of that going on here.
So was Naomi functioning from the get-go by chance?
Well, I don't know.
Because of, by going back to
Mhm.
Bethlehem, she, there's a chance that she could use her husband's land, to make them accepted or to get them position.
I think this is one of the questions that the text raises. What's going on here? Remember, one of the lenses that we can use to read the Book of Ruth is wondering, how does God's providence work? How does it work? Is Naomi, Job in a skirt? I mean, because some of the same questions are raised. Now, notice that Naomi's complaint in chapter 1, the hand of the Lord is against me, which sounds a lot like Job, and the hand of the Lord is against me. I mean, that gets reversed. If you look in chapter 2, verse 20, so here's this, this miraculous harvest of grain and the meeting with Boaz and all that. And in verse 20, then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "Blessed be the Lord," that's the real first name for the God of Israel. "Blessed be the Lord, whose kindness no longer is the Lord's hand against me. Now, the Lord's kindness has not forsaken," and notice what's said there, "the living or the dead." Elimelech's misfortune is now reversed. I mean, who are the dead? It's Elimelech and Mahlon and Chilion, right? So what looked like the hand of the Lord against Naomi has now been reversed.
What verse is that?
Chapter 20, or verse 20 of chapter 2. So there's some of that conversation. How does God's blessing and guidance and provision, how does that work? And it appears, I think that it appears that the writer or writers of Ruth see God's providence as working a lot of times very much in the background. We sometimes say to each other, coincidence is when God chooses to remain anonymous, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily an accident. I don't know about that. I don't think I get to know all the ways how God works exactly, but it seems to be in the background, and it appears that God's providence happens through people. Through Boaz, for example. Boaz is ultimately their redeemer, their provider, their protector. There's not much mention of how God works. Once in a while it pops up here and there, but it's pretty infrequent.
I think right away you see it when she moves to Israel. I mean, because we know the rest of the story.
Right, yes. Yeah. Although, again, it depends on how you read it. There were rabbis who read this text and said the reason that Elimelech and Mahlon and Chilion died in Moab is because they took all their money and left Israel in the midst of the famine instead of staying and supporting their relatives. Now, it doesn't say that anywhere. No, it doesn't. And I think maybe that is stretching the text, but that is how some interpreters have read it.
Is this the same famine of Joseph's time?
No, this is in the time of the judges. So this is significantly later than the time of the famine, or of the Egyptian sojourn. In the time of the judges, it's interesting that that's mentioned there. This comes in our Christian canon. It comes right after Judges for exactly that reason, because it's set the time of the Judges. The indictment of Israel in the time of the Judges is that they were sort of lawless people. over and over in the book of Judges, it says, in those days there was no king in the land, and everyone did what was right in their own sight. Now, we modern sort of individualistic small L liberals would say, oh, that's a good thing. Well, no, in the ancient world, that was not regarded as a good thing. That was regarded as chaos. What the book of Judges says is there was no king in the land, and so everyone did what they damn well pleased. And so this is the time in which the book of Ruth is set. So was Elimelech's action, was it a good thing? I think the mention of Judges maybe is a little bit of a negative description of what Elimelech does. Biblical scholars differ on that, and that's why they write books, and so it might not be that way either. But there's some question about what that means.
Did they forsake the worship of their God and take on, worshiping with the wives? So
they head off to another country, and you might remember me mentioning Paula Fredrickson's words. Gods are in the blood. I mean, the connection between the worship, gods were local. One of the things that's unusual about the God of Israel is that the God of Israel apparently is not a respecter of borders and goes messing around in Egypt and perhaps in Moab. But, we don't know. A few of the rabbis who comment on this later make exactly that point. They left Israel. They embraced this foreign culture, and so of course then they died. They were rendered impotent and they died. Well, it doesn't say that in the text, but that's a conclusion that some interpreters drew among the rabbis. I don't know if that's the writer's intention or not. It doesn't say if they embraced this, the Moabite cult or cults. If we're thinking a little bit as sort of sociologists, historical sociologists, in the 11th century BC, if you moved from one country to another, you would be expected to adopt at least the public practice of respecting the local gods. If Elimelech and his family had not, for example, participated in whatever public rituals there might have been, they would have been regarded as subversive. Because, again, Paula Fredrickson says, happy gods make for happy people. And the way to keep the gods happy is to respect them and to honor them in the public cult. And if you don't do that, then the gods are unhappy, and then people suffer, and then it's your fault. So just kind of thinking along those lines, we could expect, in the backstory, we could expect that Elimelech and his family did participate in the local cult, at least publicly. And remember, we have this idea that religion is something that can be separated out from the rest of life. Most of the rest of humankind doesn't think that, historically or now, for that matter. We have this idea that somehow, my religion is this thing that's portable. It goes with me, or I can trade it in for a different model, or. In the ancient world, for example, gods don't travel. Yeah, go ahead.
When you talk about local gods, what do you mean?
Well, cultural, tribal, national. The God, so it's, in the Old Testament, it's the God of Israel that's talked about. And Israel is a location as well as a people. The gods of Moab. Moab is a location as well as a people.
It's the same God.
No. No, they would not have said it's the same God. No.
Well, did they identify it as
If it's not the
a
same
person or
God,
an object?
thou shalt have no other gods before me. We have one God.
No, that's not what that says.
Huh?
That's not, just read the words. You shall have no other gods before me. That means there are other gods, but they can't come first.
Ah,
I mean, if there aren't any other gods, why have that commandment? Yeah, I mean, monotheism in the way that we understand and experience it is a relatively recent invention. I mean, as in the last 1,200 years or so. It's not directly transferable. It doesn't work in these texts in the same way. I mean, one of David's innovations, I think, historically, is that he insists on a monotheism that's closer to what we would understand it to be. But he's kind of an innovator, I think, in that regard. You've got Jacob and Rachel, who are leaving Rachel's father Laban. And what does Rachel, I mean, they take lots of things with them when they leave, but one of the things that they take is the household gods. And Laban wants them back. I mean, little statues. And Laban wants them back. And Rachel's not going to part with them. And she's got them tucked under her skirt. And Laban's men are searching for his household gods in the caravan. And they get to Rachel, and they're going to search her skirt, except she says, I'm having my period, so I don't think you should. That's the story. The Old Testament is filled with clever women.
Didn't they consider those idols?
No. No. They didn't. Yeah, we're not talking about Isaiah and Jeremiah here.
boy, I tell you what, this is like, shoot.
I just think we're not even done with chapter 2.
I know.
So, archaeologically, for example, in Israelite sites here in the Iron Age, and that's the time that we're talking about, the time of the Judges and Kings, archaeologically, in sites that are clearly Israelite houses, and they're identified clearly in a variety of ways, there are the remains of little statuettes of this, that, and the other kind of god and goddess. Yeah. Were they monotheists? Yes. The God of Israel is at the top. Were they monotheists in the way that we think about it? There's this one overarching God and really everybody worships the same God whether you know it or not. No. That's just not, that's anachronistic. That's taking our assumptions and transplanting them 3,000 years in the past.
So I can have money.
No, you
or
can't.
Power, or whatever, as a god, as long as it's not.
Well, now on the one hand, no, of course not. You know better. I mean,
Well, this is what you're telling me.
yeah, it's just as anachronistic to take things from 3,000 years ago and transplant them to the present. So it does the same thing. On the other hand, if those, remember the Apostle Paul talks about principalities and powers, and I mean, the Apostle Paul is convinced that there are divine and semi-divine powers in the universe. I mean, there are things happening that we don't see that are real. If those things which God has made, money, power, sex, words, whatever, if those things are in the service of God, then good.
Okay.
If they are used to oppose God, then they're idols. So on the one hand, no, we're not Iron Age, polytheists. On the other hand, yes, there are powers and forces that either can be used to draw us closer to God or get in the way of that. Money, sex, power, etc. So, it's a helpful image for understanding those relationships. So, you never get a straight disagreement out of me.
Yeah.
Well, my comment may be way off field, but when Moses came down from the hill,
Yeah.
and they were worshiping idols, he was so upset. And wouldn't this be the same thing?
No. And yes.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
But mostly,
That's true.
but mostly no. Because on the one hand, yes, the first commandment is the first commandment because it's the first commandment. That's right. You shall have no other gods before me. The golden calf. What does Aaron say to the people of Israel? He says, "Behold, Israel, here is your God." That's what he says about the golden calf. So it is the golden calf instead of the invisible God of Israel. So it's the besides, it's the instead of that's the real problem. As a matter of fact, archaeologically, there are statues of calves and bulls, again, in Israelite homes in the Iron Age. There are little statuettes of calves and bulls in those 10th century homes that have been found by archaeologists. Well, but what's the piety? The God of Israel stands on the back of that bull. So that's the relationship. Which God is the God with a capital G? The God of Israel. But they don't assume that there are no other gods or forces or powers in the universe. They would not assume that the gods of Moab were figments of people's imagination. They wouldn't believe that. And especially if you're living in Moab, don't tick them off. Don't take any chances. So I think, back to your question, Darlene, I think that they probably would have at least given some public acknowledgement of the local gods. And some of the rabbis, after the exile and closer to our own time, said, this is why they died. Well, that's importing a sense from 1,500 years later back into the Iron Age, for example, which I think makes more sense to us than it would have to Elimelech. So how's that for a simple answer?
So it was okay, see, and I gotta wrap my head around this. Okay, things like rabbit's foots and horseshoes.
No, we're talking archaeology, not theology.
But so
Don't
because I've always said
don't collapse 3,000 years of history.
but you've got the God of Israel. If you rely on any other thing you give power to, you are serving another idol. You are serving something other than the God above.
But that's true now. We understand that.
But then it was.
Right. I mean, we're talking about, if you want to hear about how they would likely have operated.
Because I'm looking at that and
it fits in
my life and my faith.
That won't work.
Going,
No, that won't work. That's anachronistic. That's trying to make archaeology and history do the work of theology. And that won't work. It's not fair to people in the Iron Age or to us. But we should not try to deny the evidence that's in the texts themselves. You don't even have to go digging in Israel to find the evidence of this. I mean, just go back to the patriarchs. Why does Rachel want those statues?
And that's the thing that really, just boggles my mind, because it's idolatry as far as I'm concerned. It's just like, we're not supposed to, but I know we do. We covet things, which is idolatry.
Yep, it is.
And wouldn't that be the same thing?
But we tend not to want to allow for there to be any development of this relationship with God throughout the Old and New Testament. We tend to say everything must have been absolutely clear in Genesis 1. Well, then what's the rest of it for then? Clearly, this develops. The story prepares us for Jesus, for example. Otherwise, why bother with it? If everything was clear from the get-go, it seems like a terrific waste of paper. So there's development that happens. Now, would we, if we were having a conversation with Elimelech, we'd say, it's not really how it looks to us these days. And Elimelech might say, well, that's fine, but, it appears to me that I irritated the God of Israel enough already. I'm not taking any chances on anybody else. I mean, and, is that right, wrong? Different. There is, Isaiah certainly looked at some of this behavior earlier in the Hebrew Bible and said, no, that doesn't work. I mean, it's Isaiah who says, for example, here's this guy in his wood shop, and he cuts a piece of wood in half, and half of it he turns into an idol, and the other half of the wood he throws on the fire to cook his supper. Isaiah's making fun of this. So there's development even in the Old Testament.
And what apostle says you have an unknown God here? Let me introduce you to the unknown God.
Well, this is Paul on Mars Hill, on the Areopagus, and he's debating with the Greek philosophers. And he says, I know that you're all deeply religious people. That's what he says to these pagans. Clearly, you're deeply religious people. Well, just look around on the Areopagus. I mean, you can't swing a dead cat without hitting a statue of some god. So clearly they are. And I see you've got this statue to the unknown God, which for them was a way to cover all your bases. Just in case we miss somebody, we don't want to irritate some God we don't know about. So here we are. And Paul says, let me explain it to you. Now, the truth is, his explanation was not very compelling. I mean, that's what it says in Acts. There were 2 of his audience who thought that maybe this made sense out of the several dozen who were there. But that's his argument at that point. It's really great that you're so religious, but, let's get clear about who you're really worshiping. So yes, that conversation.
They were to, okay.
Yeah.
Opening a door that they might be willing to.
We come at this. Wow. I'm reluctant, but I'll just take a little swing at it here. You can look at these experiences really in a couple of different ways. Mostly, we have been trained and formed to come at all of this in a very kind of Protestant sort of framework. And by that I mean, knowledge of God comes through the revealed Scripture, through the Christian Bible, through Jesus, and that's it. And anything else is out of bounds and idolatry. I mean, that's sort of Martin Luther, but it is certainly John Calvin, and it's certainly, in some ways, Karl Barth. But much of Christian tradition sees, for example, the pagan philosophers as sort of preparing the ground for the gospel. If you look at some of the earliest Christian theologians, they're well trained, for example, in Greek philosophy, and they see Plato and Aristotle as kind of plowing the ground, preparing people intellectually and other ways for the gospel. And that's a whole nother way to see this, that God's revelation also comes outside of Scripture to some degree, that God is able to work outside the church, for example, and outside of the Bible. Martin Luther talks about two kinds of knowledge of God. He talks about special knowledge of God. This is what comes through the Scripture, through Jesus. And he talks about general knowledge of God, which anyone can have. And it's that general knowledge of God which can prepare people, can make people hungry for the gospel. C.S. Lewis, for example, atheist. First, he becomes a theist before he becomes a Christian. And he becomes a theist through literature and philosophy. Those things prepare his soil for the gospel. So that's part of Paul's argument, really. You know, I'm not going to tell you that all this other stuff is just baloney and terrible and demonic and all that. No. The Holy Spirit has been using things to prepare you. It certainly is my experience. There comes a point at which all these other things I'm thinking and reading about finally click into place when Jesus is in the right spot. So that really would be a way to read this. And especially in terms of the Book of Ruth. You know, there's all this as it happened and by chance, and here they are, and we stumble across each other, and, you know, isn't that interesting? Well, no, the truth is, they're in the background, whether you can see it or not. God is working. And using events and people and things that we ourselves would not have imagined would be part of the deal. So the vision of God's working in Ruth, I think, is very expansive. It's not just limited to, thus says the Lord, here it is, this is what you do. The God of Israel in Ruth is a lot bigger than Israel, for example. Apparently is working in Moab as well. So okay, well, that wasn't quite as bad as I thought it would be. I was able to trim it down a little bit.
So in other words, I say we, me, have tunnel vision.
Yeah, sometimes. Yeah, I think that we American Protestants have kind of been trained with only one way of seeing how God works, rather than having a more expansive way. So the Eastern Orthodox tradition in its various expressions, for example, would have a much broader view of where and how God works. Or even, Roman Catholic theology is much more expansive in terms of the ways in which God works in the world than Protestants historically have been. So yeah, we have had a tendency to kind of limit the scope of God's activity more than is helpful, I think. And that keeps us from starting to muck around in things that could get us in trouble. Like, I mean, we are protected a bit from excesses of idol worship, I think, when we have that narrow focus, but we also limit the scope of God's activity. And I think Ruth is a book that wants us to expand our imagination in terms of where and how God can work to get done what needs doing. Okay, well, next time we'll still be in chapter 2, because I'm not sure we talked about anything on this sheet. Well, a couple things, but yeah, a couple things. So, very good. Thank you.
Thank you.